By the time the association slapped me with a $3,000 drought citation, the sky over our neighborhood looked like chalk and the asphalt out front shimmered in the heat. I remember standing in my driveway, holding that notice in my hand, thinking about one very simple question: was this the moment I finally pushed back against a board that hid behind property values, or did I just swallow it like everyone else? The citation was tied to 2 beige plastic barrels tucked behind my side gate, quietly catching the few inches of rain we might get all summer, and the board claimed those barrels were dragging down the worth of every house on the block. On paper, it sounded ridiculous. In practice, it was expensive. $3,000 for trying not to waste water in the middle of a drought emergency. The notice said I had violated a previously adopted rule buried under Section 10.2 of our covenants, a section I barely remembered skimming when we bought the place. It framed my rain barrels as some kind of menace to the community aesthetic, as if 2 containers behind a 6-foot stucco wall could single-handedly tank the market. That was their angle, anyway. I wish I could say I stormed into action immediately, but that is not how this started. At first, I just felt that mix of embarrassment and anger that the board is so good at weaponizing. Their wording always makes you feel like you have done something shameful, like you have broken an unspoken pact with your neighbors. I stood there imagining everyone on our street whispering about my illegal barrels, imagining my name getting read out in some meeting as the guy who threatened curb appeal. Underneath all that, though, another thought started to form: if they were going to use the rules against me, maybe I needed to learn those rules better than they ever expected. Because this is not just a story about water or barrels or even money. This is a story about what happens when a small group of people realize they can use a homeowners association as a shield and a weapon at the same time, and what happens when one homeowner decides he is done playing along. When my partner and I moved into Saguaro Ridge Estates 3 years earlier, the place looked like a sun-faded postcard. A hot wind pushed dust along the curb and rows of single-story homes sat under the same pale clay roofs, with the same gravel front yards, the same tired yuccas and saguaros. The brochure called it low-maintenance desert elegance, but everyone knew the real selling point: the association kept everything neat. No cars on blocks, no wild paint choices, no lawn ornaments that made the cul-de-sac look tacky. At least, that was the promise. The board loved that word, neat. Neat lawns, neat driveways, neat bushes trimmed into obedient little spheres. The president, a woman I will call Ms. B, lived 2 streets over from me and treated her role like a full-time job. Her front yard looked like a model home, not a rock out of place. She wore big sunglasses, walked the neighborhood with a clipboard, and talked about protecting our investment more than most people talk about their kids. The treasurer, Mr. K, was quieter but always hovering nearby at meetings, the one who reminded everyone that fines weren't necessary. Then there was the compliance chair, the one neighbors called the Karen behind closed doors, whose favorite hobby was spotting violations from her kitchen window. When we closed on our house, they handed me a thick packet: covenants, conditions, and restrictions, along with architectural guidelines, landscaping rules, and a sheet of community standards. I flipped through it once, half paying attention, just trying to find the big things. No RVs in the driveway, no chain-link fences, no painting the house neon. Section 10 caught my eye only because it was long. It covered exterior modifications, landscaping, and visual harmony. Section 10.2, in particular, was a dense paragraph about structures or devices visible from neighboring lots or the street which may negatively affect property values. At the time, that sounded reasonable enough, if vague. For the first couple of years, the association stayed mostly in the background. We paid dues, waved at the landscapers, and occasionally got an email about a mailbox that needed repainting. I heard stories about people being told to move their trash cans or trim a bush that grew over the sidewalk, but nothing that seemed too wild. You can live with some nuisance if it keeps the neighborhood from turning into a free-for-all. Then the drought got worse. The city tightened outdoor watering schedules, and our utility bills got brutal. The news kept talking about reservoirs shrinking and emergency measures. The city mailed everyone a glossy brochure that summer, encouraging residents to rip out grass, install drip irrigation, and even consider rainwater harvesting. Inside, there was a whole section on rain barrels, complete with pictures and a note about small rebates if you installed them. I am the kind of person who collects little projects, and the idea clicked immediately. Why not set up a couple of barrels on the side yard, where the roofline already funneled water off the back half of the house? We had a side gate, a 6-foot stucco wall, and a gravel strip that nobody could see from the street unless they craned their necks and trespassed. It seemed like the perfect spot. Before I even bought anything, I thought about the association. I knew our rules could be strict. I skimmed the CCNR packet again, searched for the words rain barrel, water tank, even harvesting. Nothing. Section 10.2 was still that same vague language about visible structures and property values, but there was no specific ban. Just to be safe, I sent a quick email to the management company's generic address, asking if there were any guidelines on rain barrels not visible from the street. Days went by. No answer. I figured silence meant it was not a big deal. I bought 2 matching beige barrels online, the kind that look like big plastic urns. I painted the visible edge to match our stucco even more closely, tucked them behind the gate, and connected them to the downspout with a simple diverter. From the street, you could not see anything. Even from the neighboring yard, you would have to be looking down the fence line through my gate slats, at just the right angle, to notice them. The first time it rained that season, the clouds rolled in thicker than I had seen in months. Thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the ridgeline and the smell of wet dust crept into the house as the wind shifted. I stood under the covered patio watching the water run down the roof and into my new setup, quietly pleased with myself. It felt like a tiny win against a brutal summer, like I was doing something small but smart. For a few weeks, that was all it was. A small, private thing. I used the water to keep a couple of desert shrubs alive in the backyard and to rinse off patio furniture. If you had told me then that my illegal barrels were going to turn my quiet little house into the center of an HOA nightmare, I would have laughed and gone back inside. The first sign that something was wrong did not come from the board. It came from a sheet of paper taped crookedly to my front door one afternoon. The sprinkler hiss echoed in the quiet cul-de-sac as I pulled into the driveway and saw a bright yellow corner flapping in the hot breeze. My stomach dropped before I even read it. It was titled Courtesy Notice, Unapproved Exterior Modification, dated July 3rd. The association logo sat at the top like a stamp of disapproval. In the middle, next to Description of Violation, someone had typed, Unapproved above-ground rainwater collection devices visible from neighboring lots. They referenced Section 10.2 by number and warned that failure to correct the issue within 14 days could result in fines, up to $3,000 under Drought Enforcement Authority. At the bottom, in a neat printed line, sat the signature of the compliance chair. That one sentence about visibility bothered me more than the money at first. My barrels were not visible from the street. They were not towering over the fence line. They were tucked behind a gate because I had tried to be careful. For them to claim they were visible, someone had to have gone detective mode on my side yard. That meant a neighbor had looked where normal neighbors do not look. Inside, I set the notice on the kitchen table and pulled out the CCNR packet again. I flipped straight to Section 10.2, my fingers leaving tiny smudges of dust on the paper. The wording was every bit as vague as I remembered. No structures or devices that might negatively affect property values if they were visible from neighboring lots or the street. No mention of water, no mention of rain, no mention of drought. I checked the date on the copy we were given when we moved in. It matched our closing. At the bottom of the section, though, there was a reference I had never bothered to chase before. See also Architectural Guideline Addendum A, 2019, as may be amended. I dug through the rest of the packet and, sure enough, there was a stapled addendum dated a year before we bought the house. This one was much more specific. It banned above-ground water storage devices, if visible, from any angle from neighboring properties or the street, and it claimed they were inconsistent with the community's aesthetic values, and could negatively impact perceived property values. So that was the hidden rule. It was not in the main covenants we all pretended to read. It was in a stapled addendum with its own numbering that most people probably never saw again after move-in. The board had essentially taken a vague line about visual harmony and expanded it into a ban on exactly what the city was now encouraging people to install. I could not shake the feeling that this was not about aesthetics at all. My neighbor across the alley had a bright blue plastic playhouse in their yard, taller than my barrels and faded from the sun. Another house down the street had an above-ground hot tub curving up over the block wall, with a cover that sagged in the middle. I had walked by chipped garden gnomes, stacked storage bins, and mismatched patio furniture. The association never seemed bothered by those. I thought back to our compliance chair, the one who always seemed to know everyone's business. Her house backed up diagonally to mine. From her second-story window, she had a clear sight line over half the block. It was not hard to imagine her noticing my barrels, zooming in with her phone, and writing up a complaint before breakfast. Still, part of me wanted to believe this was a misunderstanding, that if I pointed out how careful I had been, the board would see reason. I called the management company, waded through hold music, and eventually spoke with a staffer who sounded like they were reading from a script as they repeated that the rain barrels were an unapproved exterior modification. They told me the board had concerns about long-term marketability and had decided to enforce the addendum more aggressively after recent complaints. When I asked why I had never heard of this enforcement push, the staffer just reminded me that all governing documents were available upon request, and that homeowners were expected to familiarize themselves with updates. When I mentioned the $3,000 figure on the notice, the staffer explained that under the drought enforcement language adopted the previous year, repeated or ongoing violations tied to water use could carry higher fines. They framed it as a necessary deterrent. I heard the phrase, protecting the community's property values, again, like a shield against any argument I could make. There was no suggestion of discussion, no hints of a compromise like painting the barrels or moving them a few inches. Just remove them or face escalating fines. By the time I hung up, my initial embarrassment had melted into something harder. The combination of the hidden addendum, the selective enforcement, and the way they leaned on property values while ignoring the reality of the drought made the whole thing feel personal. It felt like the board had decided they knew better than the city, better than common sense, and that anyone who questioned them was a problem to be fined into submission. I put the courtesy notice next to the CCNR packet and grabbed a highlighter. I marked every mention of Section 10.2, every reference to aesthetic values, every reference to fines and enforcement. I slid the yellow notice into a clear plastic sleeve and labeled it in a folder, Drought Compliance Citation, Courtesy Phase. It looked like a small thing on my desk, but it was the first piece in what would become a whole stack of evidence. Over the next couple of days, I started paying closer attention every time I walked or drove through the neighborhood. I took mental notes of every object that stuck over a wall, every piece of yard clutter, every storage bin or planter that could be argued as visible from neighboring lots. A trash can left at the side of a house long after pickup day. A rusting metal trellis leaning against a fence. A satellite dish bolted at a weird angle. If the board really cared about visual harmony, they had plenty to work with before coming for two hidden barrels that matched our stucco. At home, I took photos, standing in the street and in my backyard, capturing the fact that my barrels were not visible from any normal vantage point. I labeled them and dropped them into a new folder on my laptop titled simply HOA Rain Barrel Issue. I scanned the courtesy notice and the addendum, circling dates and phrases. I was not yet sure what I was going to do with all of it, but I knew that if this turned into a fight, I did not want to be scrambling for records later. The thing about a homeowners association drama like this is that it does not explode all at once. It creeps. One piece of paper, one vague section number, one neighbor with too much time on their hands. But once you start looking at how the rules are written and who they are used against, the patterns become hard to ignore. This did not just feel petty, it felt targeted. My 14-day clock was already ticking. According to the notice, if I did not cure the violation in that time, the board could start formal fines without another warning. That meant the barrels had to be gone by the date circled in red at the bottom of the page, or I would start moving toward that full $3,000 hit. I could quietly roll them out and pretend this never happened, or I could push back and risk becoming the board's next example. I sat at the kitchen table that night with the CCNR packet spread out in front of me, the courtesy notice, and a notepad where I had started scribbling dates and questions. Somewhere between the vague language of Section 10.2 and the city's rainwater brochure still magnet to my fridge, I realized something important. The board was counting on most people never reading past the headings. They were counting on homeowners being too busy or too intimidated to challenge them. That thought settled in my chest heavier than the heat outside. I decided I was not going to be one of those people. I would dig into every guideline, every addendum, every email I could get my hands on, and I would find out exactly how far their power went. Because if they could twist Section 10.2 into a weapon against two hidden barrels during a drought, what else were they willing to do in the name of property values? I looked again at the circled deadline on the notice and at the empty folder waiting for more documents. The countdown had started, and with it, something in me shifted from annoyed homeowner to reluctant investigator. I had 14 days before the barrels either disappeared or turned into the most expensive water I had ever collected, and I was starting to realize that if I lost this fight, the board would learn they could rewrite any rule they wanted and nobody would stop them. Once I decided I was not rolling the barrels away like a scolded kid, my kitchen turned into a paper battlefield. The courtesy notice sat at the center, with Section 10.2 highlighted like a bruise. I opened my laptop and went hunting for anything that mentioned rainwater and homeowners associations in our state. The air conditioner hummed in the background, struggling against the heat pressing at the windows, while the smell of dry dust seemed to seep in anyway. That was when I stumbled across something the board clearly hoped no one would ever read. Buried on a state government website, under water conservation laws, there was a section about residential rainwater harvesting. It encouraged homeowners to install small collection systems, especially in drought zones, and, more importantly, said that community associations could not unreasonably prohibit low-profile systems placed behind fences or walls where they were not visible from the street. The language was careful, full of definitions and exceptions, but the main idea was obvious. I printed it out and slid it into a clear sleeve, labeling it with a sticky note, State Water Conservation Act Section 42-110, Rainwater Protection. Prop number 2 in my growing pile. Between that law, the city's rain barrel brochure on my fridge, and the association's own vague use of Section 10.2, the board's position was starting to look flimsy. They were claiming my barrels hurt property values and violated aesthetics, but the state was saying they could not ban what I had done if it was low profile and behind a wall. Next, I sent a written request to the management company asking for any board meeting minutes, policy statements, or emails related to drought enforcement and water storage over the past 2 years. I cited the right section of our governing documents that gave owners the right to inspect records, because if the board was going to hide behind Section 10.2, I wanted to see how they had been talking about it when they thought nobody was listening. The response did not come quickly. Days ticked by. I watched the date on the courtesy notice inch closer, the circled deadline staring at me from the refrigerator door every time I opened it. I spent those days documenting everything. I took more photos of the barrels from every angle, kept copies of every email I sent, and even printed a calendar where I marked when the city sprinklers at the community entrance ran longer than the posted schedule. If the board wanted to claim the moral high ground on water use, I wanted evidence of their own habits. Finally, a package arrived from the management company, a slim stack of board minutes and a handful of email printouts. I spread them out on the dining table, the pages rustling under the ceiling fan. That was where I found the third piece of the puzzle, a board agenda excerpt from a meeting dated March 10, titled Water Use and Community Aesthetics. It was short, but one line stood out. The board had discussed the city's rain barrel rebate program and decided not to promote it in the neighborhood because they were concerned about the visual impact of above-ground water collection devices on perceived property values. There it was in black and white. The board knew the city wanted people to install rain barrels, and they had decided the neighborhood's look mattered more. They did not even pretend to care about conservation, they were worried about perceived worth. I slid that agenda excerpt into another sleeve and labeled it, Board Agenda Excerpt, March 10, Rain Barrel Rejection. Between that and the Addendum A, 2019, a pattern was forming. My deadline arrived before I was done piecing the pattern together. On the 14th day, the heat outside felt heavier than usual as I came home to find another paper on my door, this one bright red instead of yellow. The sprinklers at the entry monument had just shut off, leaving damp dark patches on the stone. This notice did not bother with the word courtesy. It was a formal violation notice, dated July 17, stating that I had failed to remove unapproved above-ground rainwater collection devices. It invoked Section 10.2 again, along with the drought enforcement policy, and at the bottom, in bolder type, It declared that a fine of $3,000 had been assessed to my account, effective immediately. Right under that, there was a line about a compliance hearing scheduled for mid-August, where I could present information if I believed the board had made a mistake. If I did not attend, the fines would stand and could result in further action, including a lien. The final violation notice, dated July 17, slid into its own sleeve in my folder, the red ink stark against the white paper. I wrote across the top, "Final notice, $3,000 fine." Section 3 of my story, the quiet conflict phase, was done. This was not about warnings anymore. The board had moved from suggestion to punishment. The weeks leading up to the hearing felt like living inside a slow-motion storm. The desert sky stayed clear most days, a harsh pale blue that offered no relief. The cicadas buzzed in the late afternoons and the sun turned the asphalt into a wavering mirror, but inside my house, the air felt different. It felt charged. I kept digging. That state law about rainwater kept nagging at me, so I read it again and again, highlighting lines about unreasonable prohibition and definitions of substantial visibility. I compared it to our Section 10.2, to the addendum, to the drought policy. The board's whole argument hinged on the idea that my barrels were visible, that their mere existence was a threat to home values, and that their aesthetic interpretation trumped everything else. The law suggested otherwise. I also read through every board email the management company had released. There were messages where Ms. B forwarded city drought alerts and added comments about keeping the entrance median green so values do not dip. There was a note from the treasurer reminding everyone that fines were an important tool, and that selective enforcement undermines our authority. There was even a short chain where the compliance chair bragged about catching a homeowner's unauthorized tree swing before it spread. None of it mentioned rain barrels specifically, but all of it revealed what the board really cared about. Not water. Not fairness. Control. At the same time, I started hearing things from neighbors. Word travels fast in a community where people walk their dogs at the same time every night. A neighbor down the street mentioned getting a warning about a hose left coiled on a side yard. Another complained about being told to repaint her mailbox post because it had faded one shade off the approved color. A third, who lived near the back wall, said the compliance chair had sent him a photo of his own backyard grill, taken from an upstairs window. One neighbor, a quiet guy I had seen at the pool a few times, pulled me aside near the mailboxes. He said he had gotten a lesser fine for a small shed that sat barely above the fence line. He had tried to argue that several other sheds in the neighborhood were taller and more visible, but the board told him those must have been grandfathered in. Nobody could explain what that actually meant. He paid up because he did not want trouble. Hearing that only sharpened my resolve. The more stories I heard, the clearer the theme became. The association talked about harmony and property values, but they enforced those ideas in ways that just happened to fall hardest on people who questioned them or did anything slightly different. This was not just a rulebook, it was a tool. A few days before the hearing, the board sent out a community-wide email titled, "Protecting Our Neighborhood's Appearance During Drought." It went on about keeping trash cans out of sight, avoiding clutter, and not installing unauthorized water storage devices that may be visible from other homes. They never named me, but everyone who had seen my notices knew who they were talking about. The email implied that these devices could make homes harder to sell and that the board would not hesitate to use all enforcement tools available. The email made me angry, but it also gave me something new for my file. I printed it and slipped it into a sleeve labeled Community Email, Appearance During Drought. That brought my evidence set to a neat stack: the courtesy notice, the final violation notice, the state law printout, the board agenda excerpt, the drought policy, the city's rain barrel brochure, and the community email. Each piece told a part of the story of how the board had twisted Section 10.2 into a weapon. I knew, though, that this was not just about paper. It was about the board's comfort with power. They were used to homeowners walking into hearings apologetic and flustered, promising to fix things, hoping to negotiate fines down. They were not expecting someone to come in with state statutes, city brochures, and their own words highlighted. The money kept looming in the back of my mind. $3,000 was not pocket change. It was months of utilities, a chunk of a mortgage payment, a vacation we would not take, savings that had not even had a chance to grow. If the board could convert 2 hidden beige barrels into a $3,000 penalty and the threat of a lien, what was going to stop them from turning any small difference in someone's yard into a bill big enough to scare owners into silence? The hearing date stayed locked on my calendar, circled in thick pen. Every time I walked past it, I felt a mix of dread and determination. The evening of the hearing came with a flat, reddish sunset that lit up the stucco walls across the street. The clubhouse where they held meetings sat near the entrance to the subdivision, a small building with tinted windows and a meeting room that smelled faintly of old coffee and carpet cleaner. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the air inside felt several degrees cooler than the scorched sidewalk outside. I arrived early, binder in hand. I had divided it into sections with labeled tabs: governing docs, state law, city materials, board records, notices. The final violation notice dated July 17, Saturday, at the front, facing me like a dare. Behind it, I had placed a copy of the state law highlighting the line about low-profile systems behind fences, then the board agenda excerpt from March 10 showing they had chosen not to support rain barrels because of perceived value, then the drought policy, then the community email about unauthorized water storage devices. A few neighbors filtered in, some for their own business, some out of curiosity. Among them was a woman I knew worked as a realtor. She gave me a brief nod and later, as people took seats, mentioned in a low aside that buyers were increasingly suspicious of rigid associations, not drawn to them. She said she did not want to get dragged into anything but quietly hoped I would push back. That comment lodged in my mind as one more crack in the board's property value narrative. The board members took their places at a folding table at the front. Ms. B sat in the center, her stack of papers arranged perfectly, flanked by the treasurer and the compliance chair. Their nameplates gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the compliance chair had a folder with photos paper-clipped inside, no doubt including shots of my side yard. The hearing itself was formatted like a routine. The association described the violation, then the homeowner got a few minutes to respond, then the board deliberated. No court reporter, no formal record beyond what they chose to put into the minutes. They read out a summary of my alleged violation, using the same phrases from the notices: unapproved above-ground water collection devices, visible from neighboring lots, negative impact on property values. They cited Section 10.2 and the drought enforcement policy. When it was my turn to speak, I did not raise my voice. Instead, I opened my binder and walked through my points methodically. I explained that the barrels were behind a 6-foot wall and not visible from the street. I described how the city promoted rain barrels as part of its conservation efforts and mentioned the rebate program printed in the brochure. I pointed to the state law and its language about unreasonable prohibition and low-profile systems behind fences. I drew a line between that law and the board's blanket ban in Addendum A, 2019, which extended even to systems like mine that met the law's criteria. Then I brought up their own March 10 board agenda excerpt, the one where they had explicitly dismissed the city's rain barrel program because of perceived property value concerns. I laid the page flat under the fluorescent glare and let the words sit there. Perceived. Not actual. Not backed by any data. Perceived. I also described the community's entrance landscaping and the way the association continued to water the median grass during restricted hours, something I had documented on my calendar. If they were really concerned about water, I argued, the logical place to start would have been their own showpiece lawn, not 2 barrels in a side yard that nobody could see under normal circumstances. The board members did not like being challenged. I could see it in the way Ms. B's jaw tightened and the compliance chair shuffled papers more than necessary. They insisted they were within their rights to interpret Section 10.2 in a way that prohibited above-ground storage visible from any angle, and they claimed that my barrels were visible from neighboring lots, citing photos from a second-story window. They brushed off the state law by suggesting that their rules were still allowed as long as they did not completely ban rainwater collection, even though in practice that was exactly what they were doing. When they asked if I would consider simply removing the barrels to avoid future trouble, I told them that this was not just about the barrels anymore. It was about how they were using Section 10.2 to overrule state-backed conservation practices and about how they were picking and choosing enforcement targets in ways that did not line up with true market value or fairness. I said I wanted the fine removed and the rule reconsidered. They did not decide anything immediately. They ended the hearing with a promise to deliberate and send me their decision in writing. The fluorescent lights buzzed, the room thinned out, and I walked back outside into the warm night air, feeling both drained and strangely clearer. In the days that followed, the association's retaliation did not come in the form of tow trucks or sudden liens. It came in subtler ways at first. I noticed the compliance chair walking past my house more often, her gaze lingering on the side gate as if she could see through it. A neighbor mentioned that Ms. B had brought up homeowners who think they know the law better than the board at a casual gathering. Another neighbor said there was a rumor that I was preparing to sue, even though I had never mentioned a lawsuit to anyone. The board sent another community-wide email about respecting the authority of elected volunteers, and reminded everyone that fines were an important tool to keep standards high. Between the lines, it was clear who they were talking about. The social pressure was meant to isolate me, to make anyone thinking of supporting me worry they would become the next target. The undertone of this whole HOA nightmare was not just rules, it was social control. The written decision from the board arrived at the end of the week. When I opened the envelope, the paper inside felt heavier than its weight. Under the association letterhead, they thanked me for attending the hearing, noted that they had considered my comments, and then delivered their verdict. The barrels remained a violation, the $3,000 fine stood, and they expected me to remove the barrels within 10 days to avoid further penalties. They addressed the state law in a single, dismissive paragraph, claiming that their rules were reasonable limitations, and that they did not unreasonably interfere with conservation because homeowners were free to use other methods. They did not address the board agenda excerpt where they had dodged the city's program or their own watering practices at the entrance. They did not acknowledge any inconsistency or hypocrisy. I read the letter twice, then added it to my binder under a new tab labeled Board Decision. It hurt, but it also clarified things. The board was not going to back down just because a homeowner pointed out inconsistencies or cited state law. As far as they were concerned, they were the last word inside the subdivision. I realized I was not going to fix this with a single hearing or a stack of documents quietly presented in a fluorescent-lit room. The board was dug in, and their power came as much from perception as from bylaws. As long as everyone believed the association could do whatever it wanted, they basically could. If I wanted to change that, I would have to work on the perception too. Over the next few days, I started having quieter, deeper conversations with neighbors I trusted. I showed a couple of them the state law printout. I let them read the board agenda excerpt where the association had chosen not to support the rain barrel rebate program. I explained how Section 10.2 was being stretched to cover anything the board decided they did not like, not just actual eyesores. One neighbor told me about a final notice he had received earlier that year about a flag bracket mounted at an angle the board did not like, complete with escalating fine threats. Another mentioned being discouraged from installing solar panels, even though state law gave her the right to do it. The compliance chair had hinted that certain panel styles would not be approved because they did not fit the neighborhood's look. She went ahead anyway, but the experience had soured her opinion of the board. As these stories piled up, a small pattern of quiet frustration emerged. People were annoyed, sometimes angry, but most had chosen not to fight because they felt outnumbered. Many of them had families, demanding jobs, or no appetite for confrontation. If someone like me was willing to push back, though, they were willing to listen, and some were willing to help. A neighbor who worked in real estate provided some insight into how buyers actually reacted to strict associations. She said that, in recent years, some clients had started asking to avoid neighborhoods with reputations for excessive fines and inflexible boards. They were worried about exactly the kind of story I was living. She did not want her name attached to any formal complaint, but she encouraged me to keep records. The more I heard, the more I knew this could not stay a private argument between me and the board. Their abuse of Section 10.2 was part of a bigger issue, a small group using vague language and fear of property value loss to control an entire community. By this point, a simple courtesy notice about hidden rain barrels had escalated into a $3,000 fine, a failed hearing, and a written decision where the board doubled down on stretching Section 10.2 beyond reason. I had a binder full of state law printouts, board agenda excerpts, drought emails, and notices that showed how the association prioritized perceived value over actual conservation, and it was becoming clear that the only way to stop this pattern of abuse was to pull their actions out of the shadows and into the wider view of the homeowners they claimed to represent. That realization marked the pivot from defense to offense. If the board's power depended on people staying in the dark or staying afraid, then my retaliation had to focus on information and visibility. I was not going to key anyone's car or do anything reckless. My version of petty revenge HOA style would be lawful, precise, and humiliating in the way only facts can be when they are read aloud in front of a crowd. The first step was to tighten my documentation even more. I organized my binder like a case file. Section 1, Notices, including the courtesy notice, the final violation notice dated July 17, and the hearing decision letter. Section 2, Governing Documents, with Section 10.2 highlighted, Addendum A, 2019, and the Drought Enforcement Policy. Section 3, External Law and Policy, including the State Water Conservation Act Section 42-110, Rainwater Protection, printout and the city's rain barrel brochure. Section 4, Board Behavior, with the March 10 Board Agenda excerpt, the community-wide drought emails, and notes on the entrance median watering schedule. I added a new prop, a printed final notice that one neighbor had shared with his permission, showing how the board had threatened him over a minor shed issue. I redacted his name but kept the dates and language intact. It was nearly identical to mine, down to the structure of escalating fines and the threat of a lien. I slid it into a sleeve labeled Final Notice, Neighbor Example, Pattern. Then I drafted a clear summary document, 2 pages long, that walked through the entire story in simple terms: the drought, the city's encouragement of rain barrels, my careful installation behind a wall, the hidden addendum, the courtesy and final notices, the hearing, and the board's refusal to acknowledge state law. I wrote it the way I wish every HOA horror story could be presented: calm, detailed, and impossible to ignore. My goal was to get this story in front of as many homeowners as possible before the next general meeting. Not as gossip, but as information. I wanted people to see exactly how Section 10.2 and protecting property values were being used and abused. I read through our governing documents again to confirm what I already suspected: homeowners had the right to submit topics for the annual meeting agenda and could request that certain issues be discussed. They could not force the board to do what they wanted, but they could force the conversation into a room where more eyes and ears were present. So I prepared a formal letter to the management company, referencing the correct section of the bylaws, and requested that drought enforcement policies and use of Section 10.2 be placed on the agenda for the upcoming annual meeting. I noted that I would present information related to the handling of rainwater harvesting devices and asked that the board be prepared to discuss how their policies aligned with state conservation law. At the same time, I printed a concise flyer to slide under neighbors' doors. It did not attack anyone by name. Instead, it invited owners to attend the annual meeting, mentioned that I would be presenting concerns about how the board was interpreting Section 10.2, and hinted that this interpretation could affect any exterior feature the board decided it did not like. I included a line about how state law supported reasonable rainwater harvesting and asked a simple question: did they really want an association that ignored that? The day I delivered those flyers, the sky was a hazy white and the temperature felt like opening an oven. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I moved from door to door, the cicadas buzzing from the Palo Verde trees. I could feel curtains shift and eyes follow me. Some neighbors stepped out to ask what was going on, and I gave them the short version. The board was stretching Section 10.2 too far. It had already cost me $3,000, and it could hurt anyone who stepped even slightly outside the board's preferences. A few people thanked me. A few looked nervous. 1 or 2 waved it away, clearly not wanting to be involved. That was fine. I did not need everyone. I just needed enough people in the room that the board could not pretend this was a private squabble. The management company acknowledged my agenda request, though in typical fashion, their email was short and careful, saying only that the board would take it under advisement. Still, when the draft agenda for the annual meeting went out, there it was near the bottom: discussion, drought enforcement and Section 10.2. They had also added a line about recent questions regarding rainwater harvesting. Seeing those words in print felt like a small victory. The issue was officially on record. The association could no longer pretend nothing was happening. The board thought a $3,000 fine and a closed-door hearing would be the end of my resistance. They had no idea that, at the next packed annual meeting, I was planning to walk in with a binder full of their own documents and turn their favorite rule, Section 10.2, into the centerpiece of a public reckoning they could not quietly erase from the minutes. The annual meeting fell on one of those late summer evenings where the sky turned the color of a faded brews and the heat lingered long after sunset. The clubhouse parking lot was more crowded than I had ever seen it. Usually, these meetings drew a handful of die-hard volunteers, a couple of curious new owners, and a lot of empty chairs. That night, the yellow glow from the windows spilled out onto a near-full row of cars, and the steady murmur of voices rolled out each time the door opened. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed and the folding chairs had been set in tighter rows than usual. A portable fan rattled in one corner, doing its best to push the cool air around the stuffy room. The board sat up front behind the same long table, with Ms. B in the center, the treasurer and the compliance chair flanking her, and two other directors lined up like bookends. Their faces had that strained, polite look people wear when they know things might get uncomfortable but are pretending everything is fine. I took a seat near the middle, my binder resting on my lap. I could feel a dozen glances flicking toward me and then away. Neighbors I had only waved at in passing were present, some clutching their own envelopes and folders, others just sitting with crossed arms, waiting. The realtor neighbor gave me a small nod from 2 rows over. The guy with the shed issue sat near the aisle, his final notice copy in a manila folder. This was not just my fight anymore, and that realization made the air feel charged, like the moment before thunder. The board moved through the agenda with their usual rhythm: approval of last year's minutes, a quick review of the budget, a report on landscaping. People listened, but the energy in the room kept drifting back to the single line printed near the bottom of every copy of the agenda: discussion, drought enforcement and Section 10.2. It sat there like a loaded phrase, and everyone knew we were moving toward it. When that item finally came up, you could feel attention sharpen. Ms. B adjusted the stack of papers in front of her and tried to frame the topic as a general reminder. She talked about protecting curb appeal, maintaining a consistent look, and how the association's drought policy was meant to ensure fairness. She said there had been questions about how Section 10.2 applied to certain devices and that the board wanted to provide clarity. That was my opening. When she asked if any homeowners had concerns related to drought enforcement, I stood up with my binder and walked to the small portable microphone on its stand. The room quieted in that way that makes every rustle sound loud. I could hear the faint whir of the fan and the distant clicking of the air conditioner from the hallway. I did not start with the legal citations or the fine. I started with the story. I described how the drought had pushed me to look for ways to save water, how the city encouraged rain barrels with a brochure and even a rebate, and how I had installed 2 low-profile barrels behind a 6-foot wall, painted to match the stucco, invisible from the street. I explained that I had checked the governing documents, found nothing about rain barrels, and even emailed the management company before installing anything. Then I walked through the sequence of events: the courtesy notice, the final violation notice dated July 17 with the $3,000 fine, the hearing, and the board's written decision upholding the fine. I held up the final notice in its clear sleeve so people could see the big dollar amount, the threat of a lien, and the reference to Section 10.2. I let the room sit with that for a beat. Once people understood the timeline, I shifted to the evidence. I opened my binder to the External Law section and described the state's water conservation law, the one that supported low-profile residential rainwater harvesting devices behind fences, and that said community associations could not unreasonably prohibit them. I did not read every line. I paraphrased the key points in plain language and mentioned the name of the statute so anyone could look it up themselves. I explained that my barrels matched the kind of system the law described. Next, I flipped to the board agenda excerpt from March 10. I read the line where the board had discussed the city's rain barrel program and declined to support it because they worried about the perceived impact on property values. I emphasized that word, perceived. I contrasted that with the fact that the city and the state had both embraced rainwater harvesting as responsible during drought. The association could not claim they were simply following higher standards, they were going against them. Then I walked through Section 10.2 itself, highlighting how it was written in broad, vague terms about structures or devices visible from neighboring lots that could negatively affect property values. I pointed out that nowhere did it mention water, barrels, or conservation. The addendum, A. 2019, had been used to stretch that vague language into a blanket ban on above-ground water storage devices, even low-profile ones behind walls. Finally, I pulled out the neighbor's redacted final notice for his small backyard shed and explained how the language and the escalation of fines mirrored mine. This was not a one-off. The board was using Section 10.2 and its related policies as a tool to clamp down on anything they personally did not like, and the threat of large fines was what kept most people from protesting. I kept my tone calm, but I did not soften the conclusion. I said that the association's current enforcement approach did not align with state conservation policy, that it relied heavily on vague language and selective interpretation, and that it created real financial risk for homeowners trying to make sensible improvements. I said that I wanted my fine removed, my barrels allowed under updated, legally compliant guidelines, and Section 10.2 clarified so it could not be stretched so far again. There was a moment of silence after I finished, the kind where you can hear people breathe. Then, a small ripple of murmurs spread across the room, followed by a few scattered claps that quickly grew into a more organized applause. The board looked genuinely taken aback by that. They were used to homeowners sighing and moving on, not backing someone who had been fined. The realtor neighbor raised a hand and stood. She explained, in measured terms, that from a market perspective, buyers were increasingly wary of associations with reputations for aggressive fines and inflexible enforcement. She said that in her experience, a community that openly supported responsible water practices and had clear, fair rules was easier to sell than one known for punishing small deviations. It was a polite, professional way of telling the board that their version of protecting perceived value might actually be hurting it. Another owner spoke about his experience with the flag bracket. He described getting a final notice that escalated out of nowhere and how small issues had been treated as major violations. He said the pattern was wearing people down. The neighbor with the shed shared his story too, emphasizing how he had been told older sheds were grandfathered without any documentation. A few more owners chimed in with mild but pointed examples of times they had felt overpoliced or unfairly targeted. The board tried to hold their ground. Ms. B insisted that they had to make difficult decisions to keep the community looking its best. The compliance chair defended the line about visibility, arguing that anything visible from any neighbor's window could impact enjoyment and values. The treasurer talked about consistency and the need for tools like fines to keep people from pushing boundaries. But with every justification they gave, more hands went up. Owners asked if the association had ever consulted legal counsel about state water laws before issuing the drought citations. They asked why the board had refused to support the city's rain barrel rebate program when it could have saved everyone money in water. They asked if any impact studies had been done to show that hidden rain barrels or small sheds actually affected home values, or if the board was acting on personal preference. At one point, a homeowner asked point-blank whether the board understood that, if their enforcement actions were found to violate state law, the association itself, not just individual owners, could end up in front of regulators or in court, and the room went quiet in the way it does when everyone suddenly realizes that the people calling the shots might be exposing the entire neighborhood to legal consequences none of them signed up for. Under that pressure, the board agreed, grudgingly, to two things. First, they said they would review the drought enforcement policy and Section 10.2 with counsel to ensure alignment with state law. Second, after some tense back and forth, they agreed to suspend active collections on all drought-related fines, including my $3,000 citation, until that review was complete. Suspension was not the same as forgiveness, but it was movement. And the meeting was not over. The final part of the agenda was the election of board members for the next term. Normally, this was a sleepy formality. Names were read, ballots were filled out casually, and incumbents rolled back in without much fuss. This year, a group of owners had quietly gathered enough signatures beforehand to nominate two new candidates from the floor, the realtor neighbor and a retired engineer known for reading every document he was given. Their names were added to the printed ballot in pen. People lined up to vote, the air thick with conversation. The fluorescent lights reflected off the glossy paper and the clear ballot box at the front of the room. When it was time to count, the management representative took the box into a corner and worked through each ballot while everyone watched. The results were read out in a neutral voice, but the impact was anything but neutral. Ms. B kept her seat by a narrow margin. The treasurer held his. The compliance chair, however, lost her position to the retired engineer, and another long-term director was replaced by the realtor. There was a small, stunned pause before the room broke into a different kind of buzz. Power had shifted, not completely, but enough. The gatekeeper who had turned her second-story window into a surveillance post no longer had an official role. Two new board members, both of whom had just heard my entire presentation and the community's responses, would now be in the room for every future decision about Section 10.2, rain barrels, and enforcement. The meeting ended with a mixture of polite farewells and half-frozen smiles. Outside, the air felt warmer but lighter. The hum of crickets rose from the gravel beds along the walkway, and a faint breeze moved the flag by the clubhouse door. My fine was not gone yet, but for the first time, it felt like the board's authority had real limits, and the neighborhood had seen it. The weeks that followed were quieter on the surface but important behind the scenes. The barrels still sat behind my side gate, their lids closed, dust lining their tops. Collections on the $3,000 fine remained officially suspended, which meant no new threatening letters showed up in my mailbox. The association still sent out standard newsletters and reminders about trash cans and holiday decorations, but there was a new undertone when enforcement was mentioned, a little less certainty, a little more careful wording. According to the notice sent after the annual meeting, the board had scheduled a special session to review drought enforcement and Section 10.2 with council. I requested, in writing, that any policy changes or clarifications be shared with homeowners in writing as well, and that the status of existing drought-related fines be included in that communication. I was not about to let my case drift into a back room and vanish. Around the neighborhood, small changes started to show. The entrance median's watering schedule was adjusted, the sprinklers no longer ran during restricted hours. A short blurb appeared in the newsletter about aligning community practices with city conservation guidelines. The Realtor board member pushed for a survey to gather homeowner input on rule enforcement priorities. It was subtle, but the association's posture was shifting from dictating to explaining. Then, one afternoon, a thick white envelope from the management company arrived in my mailbox. The air was still and hot, and the sound of a distant lawn blower echoed off the stucco walls as I walked back to the house with it in my hand. Inside, there was an official letter on association letterhead titled, Resolution regarding drought enforcement and Section 10.2. The letter laid out the results of the board's review. It stated that, after consulting council and reviewing state water conservation law, the association was revising its enforcement of Section 10.2 as it related to rainwater harvesting devices. Low-profile systems installed behind fences or walls, not visible from the street, and in neutral colors would no longer be considered violations. A short new guideline spelled out basic safety and maintenance expectations, but it expressly allowed the kind of setup I had. More importantly, in the middle of the page, there was a paragraph that made me read it twice to be sure I was seeing it correctly. It said that, in light of updated understanding of applicable law, the association would be rescinding all previously issued fines related solely to rainwater harvesting devices installed in locations consistent with the new guideline. That included my $3,000 fine. The letter specified that any liens or collection actions based solely on those fines would be removed or closed. At the bottom, there was a line addressed specifically to me, confirmation that my account had been adjusted and that my status was current, with no outstanding balance related to the drought citation. I held that letter next to the original final violation notice dated July 17 and felt the weight of the entire journey between those two pieces of paper. The amount that had once been a threat now existed only as a reminder in a binder and a lesson for the board. The association did not apologize. There was no admission of wrongdoing, no mea culpa about having pushed Section 10.2 too far. But in conservative HOA terms, rewriting a rule, rescinding fines, and formally aligning with state law was about as close to an admission as I was going to get. My retaliation had never been about humiliating individual board members in the way a Karen neighbor drama usually plays out. It had been about shrinking an overgrown sense of power back to its proper size and making that correction stick. The outcome turned what could have been just another HOA nightmare into something closer to a hard-earned win. It felt, in its own quiet way, like a satisfying revenge story. In the weeks after the resolution, other small shifts became visible. The retired engineer on the board pushed for clearer language in several sections, not just 10.2, to reduce vague phrases that could be abused. The realtor kept asking, in meetings, how new policies would be perceived by potential buyers who did not want to live in constant fear of fines. The newsletter began summarizing key decisions in plain language instead of cryptic bullet points. Neighbors started approaching me in more relaxed ways. Some thanked me for taking the risk of challenging the board. One said he had been on the verge of selling and moving somewhere without an association, but knowing that the board could be pushed back into alignment made him reconsider. Another mentioned she was putting in a small, low-profile rain barrel system of her own, now that she had something in writing to point to if anyone complained. This was never going to become some epic HOA versus homeowner legend in the legal books, and that was fine. It did not need to. It just needed to be enough to remind everyone that the governing documents were not meant to be a blank check for whoever happened to be sitting at the front table that year. Tell me your HOA drought rule horror in one sharp sentence.